In the sprawling, ever-rotating jukebox of Christmas music history, the 1990s occupy a strange and surprisingly subdued corner. It wasn't a decade devoid of holiday songs, but it was unusually quiet when it came to producing new, lasting Christmas hits. Not completely silent, of course. Mariah Carey practically redefined modern holiday music with the release of All I Want for Christmas Is You in 1994, a song so effective and enduring that it now feels like it's always been there, like mistletoe or gift wrap. But beyond that singular juggernaut, the rest of the decade feels curiously hollow. There's a lingering sense that something didn't happen, not just a lull, but a full-blown cultural pause on new Christmas classics. And that pause was perhaps most noticeable on the West Coast of the United States, a region known for setting trends, reinventing sounds, and shaping the future of American music with uncanny speed. In a place where musical revolutions had become seasonal occurrences, the absence of holiday bangers wasn't just a gap. It felt like a glitch in the system. At the beginning of the 1990s, the American music landscape was shifting dramatically, and nowhere was that shift more powerful than on the West Coast. The underground currents of the 1980s, West Coast hip-hop and the emerging grunge movement, were bubbling over and taking center stage. NWA had just detonated any remaining illusions about what rap could or couldn't say, unleashing a wave of raw, unfiltered reality from Compton to the nation at large. Around the same time, just a few hundred miles north, the Pacific Northwest was incubating something else entirely. Nirvana was fine-tuning the quiet, loud dynamic that would soon crack the mainstream open like an egg. With this kind of music rising to dominance, it's no surprise that traditional holiday themes, jingle bells, chestnuts, cozy firesides, sounded hopelessly out of place. Christmas songs didn't fit the mood of the moment. They didn't belong in the same world as gangsta rap, riot grrrl punk, or the grunge dirges echoing out of rainy Seattle garages. By the time each December rolled around, the prevailing mood of the youth-driven music scene had little room for sleigh bells or snowflakes. Music was confrontational, disillusioned, defiant, emotionally raw in ways that didn't translate well to caroling. Artists were exploring themes of alienation, violence, identity, and systemic breakdowns. A holiday song would have felt like a commercial interruption. There was simply no room for it. You couldn't go from a rage-fueled verse about police brutality or existential dread into a cheerful chorus about Frosty the Snowman and expect anyone to take it seriously. Radio culture added another layer to the freeze-out. On the West Coast, particularly in sprawling urban hubs like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego, FM stations were becoming increasingly fragmented and genre-specific. You had modern rock stations that only played the latest from Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, or Bush. You had smooth jazz stations, tightly curated R&B playlists, cutting-edge hip-hop channels. There was no crossover, no one-size-fits-all top 40 dominance like in previous decades. That meant holiday music had to fight for a space that didn't really exist. Unless you were on an oldie station or a soft rock outlet, Christmas music was largely off the air. And even when it did show up, it often arrived with a wink of irony. Novelty songs, punk covers of Silent Night, or lounge versions of Jingle Bells played more for kitsch than sincerity. There were outliers, of course. In Los Angeles, KOST 103.5 was the reliable holdout, going all in on holiday programming every December. They ran marathon blocks of classic Christmas tunes. Your Bing Crosby, your Nat King Cole, your Brenda Lee. But those selections weren't new, and they weren't aimed at the youth market. They were comfort food for an older generation, a throwback to a time when the Christmas songbook felt like a living, growing canon. For younger listeners on the West Coast, kids raised on skate punk, G-funk, and MTV, the holiday music on offer felt hopelessly outdated. And when it wasn't old, it was Paul McCartney's Wonderful Christmastime, a song that managed to become one of the most divisive seasonal staples of all time. Everyone claimed to hate it, yet it still found its way into every store, commercial, and shopping mall like some sonic version of tinsel you couldn't peel off. Meanwhile, the pop landscape of the early 1990s found itself in a kind of artistic limbo, a transitional zone where the defining sound of the era had yet to fully crystallize. Teen pop hadn't truly ignited the cultural fuse just yet. This was still a few years before the rise of Britney Spears, NSYNC, and the tidal wave of glittery, choreographed energy that would come to dominate the tail end of the decade. Most of the major stars commanding the charts during this time, icons like Whitney Houston, Madonna, and Janet Jackson, were focused on evolving their sound, pushing into more mature, sometimes edgier territory. They were refining their craft, exploring new genres, experimenting with image and production, and maintaining their status as hitmakers. But none of them were particularly drawn to the idea of recording Christmas singles, at least not original ones. The holiday lane just didn't align with their branding or creative focus during that period. Christmas albums did exist, of course, and you could always count on a few being released each year. But they tended to come from legacy artists, often singers whose best-known work was already behind them or whose names carried nostalgic weight. These releases were safe bets for record labels, collections of standard covers, and familiar arrangements that were unlikely to tank, but also unlikely to spark any real cultural moment. Most of them were made for seasonal background listening, inoffensive, cozy, and instantly forgettable once January hit. There was little motivation for even the most talented contemporary artists to take a risk on an original holiday song when the return on investment was so uncertain. The classic tracks from the 40s, 50s, and 60s still dominated radio rotations every December, and the royalties from that evergreen catalog continued to flow reliably. In that climate, making a new Christmas song was like trying to break into an elite club that had long ago closed its guest list. By the mid-1990s, however, something began to shift. The cultural air felt different, more playful, more polished, more open to bold pop gestures. It was in that atmosphere that Mariah Carey released All I Want for Christmas Is You in 1994. The song didn't just arrive, it exploded. With its Phil Spector-inspired production, gospel-inflected vocals, and joyful energy, it managed to feel both retro and fresh at the same time. It sounded like something that had always been there, like a missing puzzle piece that finally snapped into place. The track quickly became a December staple, saturating every retail space and radio station across the country. Even on the West Coast, where the sun rarely yielded to a white Christmas, the song took over. In malls across Burbank, you'd hear it echoing off the tile floors while shoppers clutched armfuls of gift bags. In San Jose, it played during late-night drives under LED-lit palm trees. In Santa Monica, it drifted through outdoor speakers as families walked the promenade in hoodies instead of winter coats. But rather than kicking off a new wave of Christmas creativity, Mariah's masterpiece may have inadvertently shut the door. Its success was so overwhelming, so definitive, that it seemed to plant the idea that the Christmas canon was complete. No one was going to top it. So why try? Artists and producers might have toyed with ideas, but few dared to go all in. And for those who did, the reward often wasn't worth the risk. Most attempts barely registered, lost in the long shadow of sleigh bells and falsetto. Still, every now and then, an oddity surfaced. A boy band would drop a peppy holiday tune to cash in on their moment. A Disney Channel special would feature an original song that briefly caught the attention of tweens and their parents. But these entries rarely had staying power. They'd pop up for a season or two, maybe even crack a playlist or two, but they didn't lodge themselves in the culture. One of the biggest reasons for this lack of staying power was the rise and eventual cultural saturation of alternative rock. From roughly 1993 to 1997, the West Coast was deeply entrenched in a post-grunge aesthetic. The airwaves were packed with bands that sounded nothing like holiday cheer. No Doubt was fusing punk with ska and pop. Sublime was blending reggae, hip-hop, and surf rock into tales of chaos and heartbreak. Third Eye Blind offered introspective, sometimes haunting lyrics wrapped in radio-friendly hooks. These bands were writing about addiction, disillusionment, and dysfunctional love, not snowflakes, sleigh rides, or mistletoe, and they had zero interest in switching lanes. Then came the late 1990s, a time when the bubblegum pop revival was in full swing and suddenly, sugary harmonies and coordinated dance moves were back in fashion. This cultural shift finally opened a window, albeit a small one, for a few holiday songs to slip into the national playlist. NSYNC's Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays arrived like a glittery gift from the peak of TRL-era boy band mania. Destiny's Child followed suit with 8 Days of Christmas, blending holiday cheer with R&B swagger, and just enough late 90s attitude to make it work. These songs didn't exactly dominate the season year after year, but they found a foothold among younger fans, middle schoolers decorating bedrooms with magazine cutouts, and teens burning custom Christmas mix CDs for each other. For a moment, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, a new generation of Christmas staples was forming. But these tracks never fully crossed the threshold into the permanent canon. Their popularity was brief, tied to a specific cultural moment, as fleeting as seasonal decorations in a chain store display. Like eggnog or tinsel, they had their place and their shine, but only for a limited time. Meanwhile, over in the indie scene, holiday music was taking on a different shape altogether. Bands like Sun 60, The Posies, and other under-the-radar West Coast acts released Christmas songs that never charted, never made the radio, and rarely got press. But they weren't trying to become holiday mainstays. These songs existed in the margins, often released on limited-run CDs or included as bonus tracks on EPs. They were passed from fan to fan, from burned CD to Napster folder, living on in the corners of the internet and in the memories of the people who stumbled onto them during a particularly formative holiday season. These weren't hits in the commercial sense, but they mattered in a quieter, more personal way. You'd find them tucked between Elliott Smith demos and Mazzy Star deep cuts on someone's carefully curated playlist. Songs that captured a mood more than a message. And in some ways, those obscure holiday tracks, the ones that never got airplay or music videos, became more meaningful than the heavily promoted singles. They were soundtracks to specific emotions: loneliness, anticipation, homesickness, or that strange melancholy that sometimes comes with the holidays. They didn't need to sell 1 million copies to feel important. They just needed to hit the right person at the right time. This brings us to the underlying question. Why, throughout the entire 1990s, and especially on the West Coast where so many music trends were born, did so few Christmas songs from the era become enduring staples? Some observers point to the cultural attitude of the time. The 90s, particularly on the coasts, were steeped in irony, cool detachment, and a resistance to sentimentality. Sincerity was often viewed with suspicion. Earnest holiday songs, the kind that wrapped themselves in cozy cliches and heartfelt cheer, just didn't align with the broader aesthetic of the era. Musicians were busy trying to subvert expectations, to stay ahead of trends, to avoid sounding like anything that could be mistaken for cheesy. And Christmas music, by its nature, is almost always a little cheesy. It asks for vulnerability, for warmth, for a willingness to lean into tradition. And that just didn't fit with the image a lot of artists were trying to project. Others argue that the problem wasn't cultural, but sonic. The 1990s were a decade of musical fragmentation. Rock split into alt, grunge, post-grunge, pop-punk, and nu metal. Hip-hop expanded in every direction, with regional scenes developing their own distinct identities. Pop went through a mid-decade identity crisis before surging back with a hyper-produced vengeance. There wasn't one dominant sound that defined the decade the way disco had in the 70s or synth-pop had in the 80s. So when it came time to make a Christmas record, there was no clear model to follow. Should it be rock, R&B, acoustic and understated, glossy and danceable? That lack of cohesion may have made it harder for any one new Christmas song to break through and stick. There was simply too much noise, too many competing sounds, and not enough space in the cultural conversation for a song about sleigh bells to cut through. And then there's the simplest, most practical explanation of all. The old songs still worked. Why try to write a new Christmas anthem when Bing Crosby's White Christmas still made people tear up, or when Brenda Lee's Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree still got partygoers dancing? These classics were already baked into our collective memory. They came with built-in nostalgia and a time-tested sense of comfort. For many artists, it just didn't make sense to compete with that. Instead, they'd record covers, reinterpretations, or nothing at all. The market didn't demand new songs. It was already saturated with proven hits. And unless you were Mariah Carey, the chances of breaking through that icy ceiling were slim. Looking back, the 1990s exist in a kind of in-between zone when it comes to holiday music. The decade was a liminal space, wedged between the glitzy excess of the 80s and the highly curated nostalgia of the early 2000s. It was a time of cultural and technological transition. When analog formats were dying, digital was still emerging, and everything about music consumption was shifting. And on the West Coast, where trends moved faster than anywhere else, Christmas music simply didn't have time to sink in. Scenes changed, sounds mutated, artists came and went. There was no stable center from which a new tradition could grow. But if you were a certain kind of kid, or teen, or 20-something, you might remember something different. Maybe you had that one-off brand Christmas CD, the kind sold in gas stations or big box stores, full of anonymous orchestras and elevator music renditions of Jingle Bells. Or maybe someone gave you a burned disc with handwritten Sharpie scrawl across the top, filled with weird little songs that never got played on the radio, but stayed in your rotation every December. Maybe it was a song you downloaded off LimeWire, or heard on a college radio station late at night. Whatever it was, it stuck with you. Not because it was perfect, but because it was yours. And maybe, in the end, that's the real legacy of 90s Christmas music. It wasn't about the big moments or the chart-topping hits. It was about the strange, scattered little memories that settled in like snow. Quiet, oddly shaped, and deeply personal. Not everyone heard them, but those who did never forgot.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199X, we're here just for you, for you.